Mind Bend. Non-ordinary and extraordinary states of consciousness for Mind Bend Creative.
Well, Christopher, it's a pleasure to have you on the Mind Bend podcast. We've been talking about doing this for a while, and I don't know if it's okay if I say your name or not, because for the longest time I only knew you as Salvia Healings, and I don't know if your name is actually anywhere on the website. Should I keep you a mystery still?
No, I will present myself to everyone. My name is Christopher Solomon, and I think my name might be on like my about page or something like that, but maybe I just refer to myself as Christopher. But other than that, no, I've got a first and a last name.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. And, I purposefully did not dig any deeper into your profile, your operations, or the history and reality of Salvia as we might be able to find it on the internet, because admittedly, I know very little.
Great.
I saw your page through another page that I follow, and I'll tell you, just the first impression was that you were a very sincere human being and a non-sensational human being. And the non-sensational component was the thing that really appealed to me, because a lot of the other content that I have managed to consume, and there hasn't been a ton of it, but things that I've caught that relate to Salvia are often pretty absurd or kind of ridiculously provocative. And not really what I'm looking for in terms of content that I feel like I can learn from, or that I feel like is something I feel good about or good about promoting, right? So it seemed like your approach to sharing about this plant, about this medicine, about this phenomenon is sincere. So would you speak to my perception of your sincerity?
Well, I'll take that as a compliment. Thank you. I feel like, yeah, especially with Salvia, there is this general air of sensationalism and absurdity and craziness when it comes to Salvia, specifically because many people take high doses of Salvia and they do have very profound, strong experiences, which are completely out of this world and can be extremely disorienting and terrifying. And I think as well, people like to have a good story to tell, so they care a lot about their huge online following, so they try to get clickbaity things as well and stuff like that. But over my years of working with Salvia, one of the things that I've come to learn is it can actually be one of the most simple, grounding, easy to engage with medicines that they are, which really take people by surprise, because I know one of the big popular stories out there with Salvia right now is, the story of this guy who smoked Salvia and then he lived like many years as someone else. And his story goes that he smoked Salvia and then he woke up in this other guy's life and he had a job, and every day he went to bed and he still woke up and had that same life. And so, yeah, there's all sorts of crazy things which can happen on Salvia, but my message is a lot more of how can we use this plant at very low doses, incorporate somatic therapy into it, use it as a tool for mindfulness, introspection. And there's also something about Salvia that the more you work with it over time, if you make a practice out of it, it does become a lot more private, it does become a lot more personal, it does become a lot more intimate. And so I appreciate about with Salvia is you can take a big dose and transcend space and time, or you can take a tiny little dose and use it for a simple, gentle meditation session. So there's a wide range of experiences that can be had with this very unique plant.
Thank you. Would you be willing to share with us a little bit about your background and how you came to be interested? Do you have a background in botany, or have you always been fond of plants of all kinds? What got you into the salvia exploration to begin with?
Yeah, well, it's been a many-year organic process that's just unfolded over the years. You know, what, you know, long story short, essentially what really got me into salvia was noticing that I had some extremely profound pragmatic healing experiences from it, physiological healing experiences from it, which I didn't know was possible. I first experienced salvia when I was in high school, because it used to be legal in all states. And salvia, as of this recording, what is the date? September 18th, 2024. It's federally legal, and it's legal on a state-by-state basis. And so, I went to a smoke shop and smoked it, and had weird tactile sensations come up, and it didn't really seem like there was much use to it. It just seemed like a bizarre experience. And the guy at the smoke shop couldn't really give any sort of guidance as far as how to use it and how much to take. Um, all he could say was it's not for human consumption. And I was like, yeah, but we both know I'm buying this to smoke it. Like, what do I do? And he was like, sorry, can't give you any info. And sort of a lot of the information out there was incorrect. The information was you had to smoke a lot of it all at once, and you had to use a torch lighter, and you had to rush through the experience. And so I had multiple experiences with salvia like that, and it was just sort of odd. I was like, this just seems like a meaningless, slightly dissociative experience. Or I'd just laugh hysterically, and it seemed as if there was nothing much for it. But then the experience changed when I meditated before smoking at one time. Just 10 slow, deep breaths. It was a very simple meditation. And that session was completely different. That's when I actually met the salvia entity herself. She materialized in front of me, a few feet to my left. There was a profound telepathic communication and deep understanding of love. And I was really taken aback because I thought, wow, this is literally the same batch of salvia that I've been smoking for a long time. But the only difference about it this time is I meditated a little bit beforehand. And now it's almost like a completely different substance. And that cued me into the fact that how you approach salvia makes a very big difference. It's almost as if you can't really approach it recreationally. If you approach it recreationally, you're just kind of going to have a shitty time. Or it's going to be sort of dysphoric, or it's going to be unnerving or scary. Um, and that was interesting to me because then I was 20 years old, and so I thought, hey, this is interesting because, I smoke cannabis recreationally. I've had mushrooms recreationally, and I've never thought to meditate before taking the mushrooms, and it's always been great every time. Um, but this was the first interaction with a plant spirit entity that I'd had that also showed me that intentionality matters. And so over the years, I just kept exploring my salvia practice and going deeper and deeper into it. And I began to notice that it was very useful for depression, it was very useful for insomnia, really good for emotional regulation, really good for boosting my immune system if ever I got sick, really good at getting pragmatic advice about next steps to take in life. And the more I was using it, and when I say the more I was using it, I mean like once a month at most type thing. I was just finding more synchronicities were beginning to happen in my life. And it just seemed like, wow, this is a tool with such varied applicable uses, and no one's talking about it. And so, I went back to school for somatic psychotherapy, and then just started educating people on it and started lecturing on it. Like every chance I could get, I would kind of talk to people about this because I'd mentioned salvia, and people would say, Salvia, that shit's crazy. No way I'm ever doing that again. And I was like, but wait, there's a different way. There's a completely different side to this. And so, I used to have a job as a financial software database person, which I really didn't like at all. And I was really bad at it. I am just not a finance database type guy, but it was a job that, it was an internship that turned into a career.
Mm.
And while I was doing that for like 6 or 7 years after college, not liking it pretty much the entire time, my salvia practice was kind of side by side, and my plant medicine explorations was side by side with that. And then years ago, I left that job and then just kind of slowly transitioned full time into salvia work.
Do you have a career as a somatic psychotherapist currently? Is that the majority of your professional practice?
Yeah, the majority of my practice is actually leading people on salvia journeys. So guiding people on one-on-one salvia journeys. I do the journeys remotely via Zoom, and then I incorporate somatic psychotherapy into it.
It does seem to be almost a clandestine operation where you can't find information not nearly as readily about salvia, or at least I don't see it, as so many other different kinds of compounds. Do you consider salvia to be psychedelic? Do you see it referred to as a psychedelic? And what kind of properties of salvia do you think would be used to represent it as a psychedelic. What's your view on that?
Right. So it does have very profound consciousness altering effects. It is the most potently occurring hallucinogenic substance in nature. So only it begins to be perceptible at about 250 micrograms, and about 1 milligram of it is considered too strong for many people.
One milligram?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So when I say 1 milligram, I mean 1 milligram of the pure Salvinorin A, which is the psychoactive component in it. Now, it is technically not a psychedelic because it's not an alkaloid, and it doesn't affect the 5-HT2A receptors. So it works on a completely different part in the brain. It works on what's called the kappa opioid receptor system. And that's responsible for regulating many things, our consciousness, our depression, our immune system, our pain as well. So salvia is a very potent analgesic. And so it affects that system. And that's one thing that makes it really nice, because I have quite a few clients who are on SSRIs.
Mm.
Because they're on SSRIs, they can't take other psychedelics, or they have to wean themselves off of it. But because salvia doesn't affect the serotonin receptors, you can be on SSRIs and use salvia, which is really great for people who are trying to wean themselves off of medication. And
As an antidepressant, as something to replace the effects of whatever they're trying to wean from.
exactly, and it's also really good for opioid and cocaine withdrawals. So actually halting the withdrawal symptoms. So you'll have someone who's like shaking and like sweating because, they haven't had their opioids that day yet. And then we just smoke one little bowl of salvia, and it just really settles the withdrawal and buys them time between doses. So it's also very useful as an aid to help wean people off of opioids.
How do you measure the potency of the substance being administered? How do you determine how densely to pack the bowl, or whether or not someone should be in for this much versus this much on their first time, or what's the advisable amount?
Yeah. So I mail people very pre-dosed amounts of salvia. So actually, for example, you can get them on my website, just these tiny little pre-dose capsules, and I'll take an amount out. So usually when people have a terrifying out-of-body experience with it, it's because they pack a huge bowl. But when I work with clients, we're using only that much. That's a teeny tiny amount. Um, this is the equivalent of, I would say, about 15 milligrams of 10x extract. And what that means is, so let's back up a second. So like, what is salvia to begin with, right? So it's just actually a regular leafy green type of plant. You can chew the leaves, or you can smoke the dried leaf. And it's originally from Oaxaca, outside of Mexico. And there's almost 1,000 different types of salvia. So the sage that you cook with is Salvia officinalis.
Mm.
The rosemary was recently reclassified to be a sage, actually. So rosemary is Salvia rosmarinus. There's Salvia recognita, there's Salvia splendens. There's a whole bunch of different types of salvia. So many people, when they do gardening, they actually have lots of types of salvia in their gardens.
Yeah, I think it's a term that I remember growing up with my mom using that term. She might have been growing it, or it was just involved in the vocabulary of her gardening. I definitely recall there always being sage and rosemary and thyme and all those wonderful garden herbs growing.
Right.
And I love rosemary and sage. We burn sage every day in the apartment.
Exactly. Right. And so, yeah, but there's this one particular type of salvia that was only found naturally in the wild in the Sierra Mazateca mountain ranges outside of Oaxaca. And it just sort of appeared, it seems. There's very little oral history or tradition as far as how it got to be so widespread there. And the Sierra Mazatecs, they call her, they believe she's the embodiment of the Virgin Mary, but they don't have an indigenous name for her. But they have indigenous names for all their other medicines. And so that kind of alludes to the fact that salvia was really only discovered and started to be used after the conquistadors finally firmly cemented Christianity all throughout the area there. So it is kind of one of the new kids on the block. And many of the experiences and lessons that people learn from Salvia are related to things like the existence of the multiverse and time travel and all these futuristic type ideas. And so, and there's nothing profound about the plant itself just by looking at it. It just has the diametrically opposed leaves. And so you can take the plain leaf and you can chew the plain leaf. So that's how they use it traditionally. They take a stack of plain leaves and they roll it up into like a cigar and they chew, chew, chew. And then you hold it in your mouth because it's only absorbed by the buccal membranes in the cheeks. And then you have like a prolonged but light to medium experience. Or you can just dry the leaves and smoke those plainly, and that would be considered 1x. 5x would be 5 grams worth of leaf, Salvinorum extracted out of that, and then put back onto 1 gram of leaf. Similar 10x would be 10 grams of leaf, reinfused back onto 1 gram of leaf. So you can make a very concentrated extract of it. So you only need to smoke a tiny amount.
What is that process, the extraction and putting it back onto the leaf? We're not talking about just a larger amount being smoked. We're talking, what's the extraction process like?
Yeah, usually you can use like a high proof alcohol or an acetone or something like that to soak the leaves in there and dissolve all the Salvinorum A in that, and then evaporate all that, and you're left with like this waxy, gooey substance. And then you can continue to do multiple washes of that. Similar to how one would, like if one does a DMT extraction and one uses heptane or naphtha, you can do multiple washes of that, and then some water washes. So you essentially do multiple washes of the substance where you remove all the lipids and the chlorophylls and everything like that, and then you're just left with the Salvinorum A powder.
And this was not the technique that was being utilized when the substance was first being used by these people in Oaxaca and that region early on. That was the chewing and the ceremonial. They recognized it as something that had a powerful metaphysical or transformative ceremonial potential.
Exactly, yeah. And it was only done through chewing and with prayers, and more specifically for healing physical illnesses. And so it was interesting, what really turned me on to Salvia one time was when it spontaneously healed the swollen lymph node in my neck that had been there for months, many, many months. And I just couldn't get rid of it. And I went to a bunch of doctors and they said I had to have surgery to have it removed. I tried changing my diet and stopping alcohol and cannabis and coffee and all these things and antibiotics. I just couldn't get rid of this lymph node in my neck. And this one time, this was probably in about 2012, I think, I smoked some salvia and I felt all this energy going to where the swollen lymph node was in my neck. And I started massaging it. And every time I massaged it, it divided in half every single time, like a cell splitting. And every time I did a full circle, it got smaller, smaller, and smaller till it felt like little grains of sand. And then when I could no longer feel it, then all the energy that went to that spot kind of like left my body and went out of the room, and the lymph node was gone and stayed gone. I remember jumping out of the bed that I was laying in, and I rushed to the bathroom, and I went like, and I looked down my throat to see if the lymph node was still there, and it was totally vanished and never came back. And it was surprising because I'd never had a spontaneous instantaneous healing that happened like that. Because that was over the span of about 10 minutes. And and I wasn't even smoking salvia for that purpose. I was just smoking salvia, just it randomly came to mind, like, hey, smoke some salvia. And so I had this spontaneous healing experience, which only then I started doing research online, and I saw that there are other people online who were reporting similar things. They're like, yeah, like I had a fever and then I smoked salvia and my fever went away. And or someone had low T cell counts because they were HIV positive and it boosted up their T cell counts. And back in 2012, it was more like the older drug forums. So it was just a smattering of experience reports of people saying how salvia made them feel better. And then only after that did I learn that the Serum Mazateca curanderos use it for healing physical illnesses.
So how is it then, to your research, that it's not been medicalized and brought into tablet form or
Mm.
used in more allopathic practices, Western medicine turned into an ointment, or are there instances where it is being used and I'm just not aware of it?
They are trying. They're trying to because it is a very potent painkiller, and so they're trying to make a painkiller that affects the kappa opioid receptors instead of the mu opioid receptors. Because when you get the mu opioid receptors activated, which is what happens when you take like a hydrocodone or something, or an opioid, um, it'll numb the pain, but then you get addicted to the substance and you build a tolerance very quickly. But when you get the kappa opioid receptors activated, it stops the pain, but you get reverse tolerance, so you need less of it over time. But the problem is when the kappa opioid receptor system is activated, it can create dysphoria in the body instead of euphoria. And that is, I believe, one of the main challenges for actually making it a over-the-counter medicine that people can just take. Because, if you take your Vicodin or your opioid, it's all hunky-dory. You can sit there feeling euphoric and people can just go about their day. But with Salvia, you sort of have to take a little bit of Salvia and you can't just go about your day. It kind of demands that you sit there and meditate with it. And because it is a physiological tactile experience that one starts to notice in the body. And that's why it's so helpful for incorporating mindfulness and somatic therapy into it. Because when I do my guided sessions with people, we'll smoke like one of those little pre-dose capsules in this. I make this special like 5-bowl water pipe that I send to people where you preload all the bowls and then you smoke a bowl. And then when you're ready to go deeper, you just pick up the bowls and rotate it and move to the next one. And then you smoke that. And then when you're ready to go deeper, you just pick that up and rotate it. And so that way you can know that each bowl has been loaded with a pre-dosed amount that is noticeable yet manageable psychologically. And then you also don't have to be fiddling with accurately trying to measure doses mid-journey as you're being taken to a different dimension.
Mm.
And so, yeah, so with the sessions with people, we'll smoke one bowl, then I start a timer and we wait for 5 minutes. And you sit there for 5 minutes and track, rather than tracking your thoughts or visuals, because it's not like cannabis and it's not like DMT, track where you feel the experience coming up in your body. You can track where it's coming from and where it's going to, the path that it's taking. Sometimes people feel things happening within their body. Other times people feel things happening outside of their body, like on the other side of the room. And they're like, well, I feel completely normal, but there's like something rotating like on the other side of the room. So it just begins to really change your awareness of initially through tactile senses, and then through the senses of your own perception of the spaciousness of your own body, and then through your perception of your emotional body. And you can feel your emotional body being separate from your physical body. And you can feel that being separate from your energetic body. And so it really gives one, there's so many ways in which it can be used. Um, People who are longtime meditators, they really find Salvia works very well for their meditation practice. There are other people who have been doing a lot of therapy with like internal parts work or internal family systems, and they find that they can communicate with different selves, different parts of themselves very clearly with Salvia. So Um, yeah, the dosing is, I've noticed that dosing doesn't really make much of a difference based on weight. So I use the same doses for everyone, but you know, rather than increasing the size of the dosage, I will play more with the timing between the bowls.
Mm.
Because there's an area where wading in the shallow waters of Salvia, and it's very easy, it's very manageable, it's very soothing, it's very grounding and supportive. But then sometimes you can go like a little bit too far, and there's always there can be that little bit of like a oh shit moment, like have I gone a little bit too far? And so rather than jumping to those spaces, I like to slowly take people into those spaces and you can gauge how deep you want to go. And the nice thing is with Salvia, one doesn't have to go that deep. You don't have to go to Salvia land, which people call the place where you meet different entities, and there's like little villages that one visits, and there is like another dimension that one can go to on Salvia, but that's not required in order to have healing effects.
A dimension that's specific to Salvia.
It's very specific, yeah.
So it's a doorway.
Oh yeah, yeah. Like, I was doing a session with someone recently, and they were sitting there, and they said they were like, a portal has just opened, like a tear in the fabric of reality has just opened just a little bit to his right. And he was like, I'm totally here and I'm in this reality, but I can feel to my right, there's this whole other dimension, and it's sort of like inviting me in. And so that's also a fun place to play there. How do you straddle two dimensions? Can you send your awareness to that dimension, but keep your body here, or vice versa? Or you can go completely into that dimension, and it is its own definite own dimension. That's as there's like dream reality, there's DMT reality, and there's Salvia reality. And Salvia reality feels way more objectively real. That's the thing where I think many people get scared on Salvia, that the shift in our perception is far more objectively real than any shift in perception from LSD or DMT or mushrooms.
As far as I know, there hasn't ever been anyone who's actually left this dimension in physical form during any kind of ceremony. But are you insinuating that you physically the body leaves this dimension as well? So that if I was in a room with you, you would disappear to me?
Yeah, like just everything just transforms into it's a complete shift in one's fundamental perception of what one's own identity and being is.
Okay, but if I was sitting in the same room as you and you were having the experience, I would still see you in this country, in this time, in this dimension, while you are saying that you would physically be elsewhere.
Right. You mean it? So if I smoked salvia and we were in the same room,
Yeah,
you wouldn't see me go anywhere,
right.
but I would be very surprised that you couldn't see what I was seeing,
Okay.
because it seems that real, and I've often had that experience with clients that I'm working with. They're like, do you see that? Like, surely you see that. I've never taken LSD and thought that someone else could also see the fractals of the patterns,
Hmm.
because like I'm the one that took the substance.
Hmm.
At a high enough dose of salvia, it just seems like reality literally changes, not just for oneself, but for everyone.
I think that maybe over time, the study of wellness and the study of healing from what we perceive as illnesses and ailments, conditions, chronic conditions that suppress our well-being will lead deeper and deeper into the study of dimensions, the study of
Mm.
reality. Because I feel like you know healing and wellness is a matter of perception
Mm.
sometimes. I think that it's arguable that your capacity to feel well or just to perceive wellness or even addiction, whether it's a habituated pattern or it's completely neurologically based, um, that there's some kind of agency in it in this dimension as we understand it. And then we look at substances like this, and that just it can't help but push us into questioning questions about our dimension and about the makeup of our reality beyond whether or not we are troubled by lymph nodes or depression or addiction.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's many people talk about salvia as what feels like a very cleansing and cleaning experience.
Mm.
And I and other people have had experiences where I felt my psyche and my awareness be removed from my body, but my body stayed behind. And while I was out of my body, I felt these little salvia beings come in there, and just cleaning things up. And it felt like cleaners, actually.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and, and the analogy that came to mind at the time was sort of like you're in a hotel room and you make a mess of the room, and then you leave and then you come back. And while you were gone, the cleaning service came in and cleaned everything up. And you're like, oh, my hotel room's clean again and the bed is made. How about that? And it felt like that. It felt like I was taken out of the hotel room of my body, and the cleaners came in and organized everything up and made the bed and washed the sheets and everything like that. And then I got plonked back in my body. Everything just felt all refreshed again.
Yeah, and I think we've heard similar experiences, like you alluded to earlier, psilocybin, ayahuasca, DMT, where there's actually a spirit or entity introduced, and then there is a purposeful intercession on behalf of the entity. Are we just incredibly fortunate, Christopher, that we as organisms exist in a world where interdimensional intercession is not done with malicious intent? Because
Mhm.
I think that's a lot of people's spiritual orientation, and considering, how to place yourself on the spectrum between good and evil, and who
Mhm.
you want to appease and whose boat you don't want to rock. And we talk about, the I think if you're raised in a Judeo-Christian tradition, the idea is that hell is essentially another dimension,
Mm.
or a dimension where there's just abject suffering and lack of love and pain, and everything that we can conjure being undesirable. But are we just incredibly fortunate that the entities that have made themselves available, whether it's in the form of salvia or psilocybin mushrooms or ayahuasca, that they are compassionate towards human
Mm.
beings,
Mm.
um or is that the nature of reality? It's just that everything else is existing with a greater capacity to love and assist, and
Mm.
we are stuck in a pattern of self-abuse and abuse of others.
Right. I think that's an excellent question. I mean, yeah, it could be that at our core, we do have a profound sense of self-love and wanting the best interest for ourselves. And maybe we get in the way of that with our own thinking patterns and our own history of trauma and our own clinging to the past and our own fear of unmanifested future expectations. And so, um, yeah, but when one gets out of the way of one's own self, I think there's just the same way that any biological and mechanical system has a drive towards homeostasis. I think the same way that if we just get out of our own way, the body has a natural proclivity to want to come to a place of normalcy. And I feel like that is one of my, without being too goal oriented, one of my goals for people is just to have them feel okay. Just feel okay, feel normal. That's totally fine. You don't have to have this profound, massive healing experience where you think you're never going to feel sad again, or um, yeah, just feel at a nice, stable, neutral baseline. And then how do you engage with the world with intentionality from that place and build on that?
And that stasis feels like an incredible gift. I know that people work through certain things to get there, and I think once you're there, you're grateful for it, and everything in life seems different. When I was, in my late teens, early 20s, I was diagnosed with depression, manic depression, anxiety, however they wanted to frame it at the time.
Mm. Mm.
Obviously, with time and retrospect, I can see things that were going on, and catalysts and environmental,
Mm.
things that were occurring, conversations that weren't being had, dialogue that
Right.
wasn't being had,
Right.
resources that weren't available. Fortunately, I avoided hardcore narcotic addiction, but I did misuse alcohol, and that
Mm.
became a habituated pattern and a very destructive pattern
Mm.
that didn't do me any favors at all. So, and it took a long time to actually, work to a point of stasis, and I'm afraid to blast myself out of what I have come to feel is a stasis that I'm grateful for. But
Right.
back in the day, like when you have anxiety or depression or whatever can be referred to as anxiety or depression, and things come on and you experience anxiousness, unrest, and like for no apparent reason, that's a
Mm.
very exhausting way
Yeah.
to live, and it's hard to
Right.
make skillful decisions in that too, when you have a propensity to be very self-deprecating and intensely introspective and negative, or
Mm.
it's
Mm.
it's just a strange thing to have to work through. But breaking out from that, I think about the fragility of my consciousness and the ways in which I did provoke states of unwellness, and alcohol was always a very destructive thing for me in terms of
Yeah.
emotionally. I would have horrific nightmares
Mm.
from after days spent drinking and trying to
Mm.
stop drinking again. Stopping the drinking was always so hard after
Right.
multiple days drinking,
Right. Right.
and it always felt like a magical, like a darkly, like a not a good magical experience, you know?
Mhm.
It felt like there were forces that were working beyond me, and these visions and nightmares and just states of mind were awful. So I would hate to see somebody, and I always hate to hear about people who are trying to endeavor to heal or find a stasis or recover,
Mm.
and an experience pushes them into a dysphoric or nightmarish situation. So
Mm.
how is it then for human beings that you could, like you said, go into that oh shit deep end past the wading pool and be thrust into a state of panic or sadness or overwhelm? I mean, why not just make it great the whole time? Why do we even have to cross over into something that's dysphoric?
Yeah, it's well, I think some people feel, there might be this underlying belief that they have to struggle with their demons and confront this horrible nightmarish side of themselves in order to feel as if they've been through enough in order to be worthy of the healing.
Mm.
Some people just think that they have to have those extremely big experiences.
Like that's
Um,
deep, that's subconsciously active. That's just something that you couldn't decide going into a ceremony that I'm going to rule that option out entirely.
yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, I think it depends what the substance is. I wonder, I mean, I think many people who will take Datura, for example, are going to have very scary negative experiences, because that is one substance that seems to maybe mm, potentially have a little bit more malicious intent than maybe some of the other plant medicines. Um,
I don't know much about Datura, but I have associations, and
mhm.
I could imagine why that would be. But you're thinking that it could be the intention of the entity behind the actual substance that we come in touch with.
Possibly, yeah. Um, yeah, so I think I think one should allow oneself at least the ability to be able to slowly wade into the deeper waters step by step and judge if that's actually really where you want to go before throwing yourself fully in there. And that's why I like working with the multiple small doses. It's equivalent to if you were to get into a hot tub of water that's very hot and you just jump straight in, naturally you're going to want to jump straight out because it's too shocking. But if you slowly ease yourself into it, then you can acclimate to the hot temperature and you can actually, before you know it, be having a nice time.
Mhm.
Um, I think, yeah, there are many times when people want to go deeper in the Salvia experiences, for example, because they think that they have to go deep in order to get to the depth of what their pain is, maybe. Um, but then they notice when they start working with Salvia, even in the shallow experiences, they're like, oh, I actually didn't need to go that deep. I thought I needed to have this big experience where I could, battle my demons or prove to myself that I was brave enough to jump into the deep end. A lot of it is about, proving to oneself, like, am I strong enough to be able to completely have a white out or black out experience and come back and be okay? And I think if one's in a already activated, dysregulated state of mind, that's not really the best thing for one. I think there are too many medicine workers out there who are advocating for like high doses only, and they're like, oh, you can only make grounds or get it better if you like have a hard reset, like a hard reboot. I prefer to say, well, let's actually work with being engaged with the experience every step of the way, being engaged with your body every step of the way, keeping your awareness there and mindfully seeing what's unfolding organically. Um, and then if you want to go deeper, you can, but still stair step your way into the deep phase instead of just catapulting yourself into there.
So catapulting yourself into there is most of the videos that people who have seen on YouTube or have
Yeah.
seen the 2020 news articles about or have watched on
Mm.
TikTok or whatever. It's people throwing themselves into total disorientation, total oblivion.
Yeah.
And I think my guess is that it's boredom that's at the root of that, or
Mhm.
self-destructive tendencies, or thrill seeking that just is kind of unhinged or ungrounded. Those do not seem to be intentionally healing or progressive or transformative efforts. They seem to be really sad to me when I see those videos.
Yeah, it is, especially if well, again, especially if people think that that's what they need to do in order to feel better. And then they just end up causing more trauma to themselves in the long run. And I've had quite a few clients who have come to me and they're like, 15 years ago, I smoked a big bowl of salvia and I had a terrifying experience, and I never want to do that again. But at the same time, it was very life-changing and eye-opening because it showed me that there is this whole other thing I can explore. And so then people come to me to help them rewrite their initial terrifying experience by reintroducing it to them with a lot more mindfulness and, again, the somatic therapy side of things.
Yes, I was going to ask you to talk about somatic psychotherapy. Would you just kind of give us a little, for those who aren't familiar with the term, and even if they are, somatic psychotherapy, what is that?
Yeah, so somatic is essentially just anything that's body-based. And it's really trusting the organicity and the wisdom and intelligence of your own body and listening to that, and listening to what it has to communicate back with one and feeling into that versus relying so much on the stories that we've created about ourselves and our identity and our past. And so it's just another way of engaging with the self or various parts of the self. And it's rooted in the present moment, it's rooted in the now. And so um, it's going to be more tangibly manageable, and you can actually tangibly interact and engage with it versus if one's feeling a lot of anxiety, for example, it's kind of like it's a very scattered mental process. It's all over the place, and it also feels like it's so for example, let's say you're doing psychoanalysis, regular psychoanalysis or talk therapy with someone who's having a lot of anxiety. You can't just say to them, calm down, or you can't point to them, the reason you're anxious is because this scary thing happened. And now that you know why, that's why you're anxious, you should feel better. It doesn't work like that. But one's much more likely to be able to engage with, okay, let's feel into the physiological feeling of the anxiety. Where is it? Kind of get a handle on where it is, what it feels like. Is there any heat to it? Is there any movement to it? Does it have a shape? Does it feel like it's moving in a certain direction? And by engaging with the body on a physiological level like that with mindfulness, it brings about a sense of curiosity. And that curiosity is extremely important in being able to have less of a felt sense of what things definitively mean. For example, I was doing a session with someone who had high anxiety. I will say salvia just by itself, a low dose of salvia just by itself is really, really helpful at settling anxiety. I know a few people who they'll smoke salvia when they're having a panic attack, like full-blown panic attack. They'll smoke a little bit of salvia and it'll just calm them right down. Um, and so, someone said it feels like they're wearing a weighted blanket when they smoke salvia because this comfortable heaviness comes over the body. Um, but I was working with someone one time and he had high anxiety. And during the second or third bowl that we were smoking, he felt like his heart rate start to increase. And he felt the physiological feeling that usually happens when he's about to have a panic attack or when he's about to get a lot of anxiety. But because salvia can do such a good job sometimes of separating our awareness of our physiological body and our emotional body and our thinking mind, he felt all those be split out. And he felt his anxiety was kind of like over here outside of his body, but then he still felt the increased heart rate, and there was a decoupling of the emotion of anxiety and the physiological response of anxiety. And that was a very profound experience for him because he thought, wow, this is new. I'm having what feels like should be leading to more anxiety based on this feeling in my chest.
I'm having the physiological symptoms.
Yeah, having the physiological symptoms, but I don't feel the emotional aspect of the anxiety. Because the emotions were no longer in his body, the emotions were removed from his body. He could feel the emotions physically being removed from his body and kind of like put over there, kind of like put on a shelf, you know? And so, and then Salvia was sort of communicating with him, and he was thinking as well, he was just like, huh, maybe sometimes like my heart rate just increases and I'm not actually that anxious of a person. It was just, it gave him a different way of seeing the fact that he can have the physiological response, but that doesn't have to mean that he's going to go down this spiral that he usually goes down. So that was just like one pragmatic example of how Salvia can help get one a felt sense of objective distance from the patterns that are living within our body.
Is smoking salvia the only method of administration that you utilize, and is that the only way to go? I have an aversion to smoking after recovering from smoking cigarettes for many years. So are there other ways to take salvia?
There are. When I do my guided sessions, I always use only smoking, for a few reasons. One is because the doses can be extremely standardized and every dose is the same. Um, the other method is essentially just chewing the leaves, but you have to have like a whole mouthful of leaves and you have to hold them in your mouth for at least like 30 minutes, and there's drool and you can't swallow the saliva. So you can't really talk to someone. I couldn't do a session with you if you have a so if you had a salad in your mouth, we couldn't really have much of a discussion going on. And as well, this is this pipe that I manufacture these myself, and I got the idea while I was meditating with salvia. But you put a little bit of water in it, and so it filters the smoke. And the amount of material that one has to smoke, you sort with such a small amount, it's essentially negligible. I've worked with quite a few people who are averse to smoking, or they have lung sensitivities, or they've been around lots of asbestos or firefighters and stuff that had like lung issues. Um, and they can smoke that no problem because it gets filtered through the water. And even when you exhale, you barely even see any smoke come out. And it's a much less harsh smoke than cannabis or nicotine or tobacco.
Do you have any heroes in this space? Any forebears that have researched salvia specifically? Because it feels to me like you're a contemporary torchbearer. And certainly my first introduction into this world, and I think doing good consistent work. Has there been anybody that's inspired you, author or personality or that sort of public figure working in salvia?
Um, Yeah, I have this thing called the Somatic Salvia Network, which is just a network where people can join a small salvia community, and it's a small group of people who are using salvia with intentionality and for therapeutic use. And I find myself being really inspired by some of the members on there who are doing earnest explorations with salvia. Um, it's wonderful just to see what other people are learning and the experiences they're having and how they share with each other in the somatic salvia network and help each other out. So I really feel inspired by people who are sort of exploring it, with an open-ended dynamic awareness. Um, Daniel Siebert, he was in 1992, he was the first person who extracted salvinorin A out of the plant. And so he was quite instrumental in um, getting salvia to be more known and isolating the psychoactive compound in it. Mm,
Siebert, Siebert.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think one of my biggest inspirations is but he wasn't Salvia related. It was someone that I used to do ayahuasca journeys with. He was he would be like the lead guide, or he would lead ayahuasca ceremonies. And I was doing a lot of ayahuasca with him some years ago. And he taught me through just watching how he held his practice and how he held his container, how to hold a really good, strong container with clear boundaries, where you could still have some levity, you could still have some lightness, some humor. The healing didn't have to be so serious, but if things got serious, you could be serious. So I really respect him a lot. Even though he had nothing to do with Salvia, he was just a really good role model for me as far as what it means to hold medicine with integrity, and the importance of the work that one's actually doing, rather than just giving people substances. There is depth to the work. But other than that, there's a good book on Salvia. I think it's just called Salvia Divinorum by the author J.D. Arthur. There are some other books by an author, Ross Heaven. He's written a few books. But yeah, I mean, as far as I know, I'm one of the only or very few people doing work with salvia in a therapeutic manner that's not in a shamanic context.
And that leads me to another question, and it's, we touched on it earlier, but why the lack of notoriety? Why the relative underground or unknown or lauded or popularized nature of salvia now? How is it managed to stay kind of, because I would have thought that just by having worked as a journalist in the psychedelic space over the last 5 years, I would have heard more about salvia by now as plant
Right.
medicine.
I think because it requires quite a lot more intentionality than many of the other medicines. It's not recreational per se. It can be fun, and it can be euphoric, and it can be full of laughter, but that's just not its default. It's a little bit weird. Most people, their first few experiences, they don't know what to make of it. So there's a bit of a learning curve. You'll smoke it and you'll be like, well, something happened, but I don't know what it was. And also, Johns Hopkins did a study on salvia, and they showed that it affects the default mode network more than any of the other psychedelics. And the default mode network, one of the things that it's responsible for is our autobiographical sense of ourself. And so we have these experiences in salvia that seem very far removed from anything that would be pragmatically applicable to our own life story. The experiences can just seem so off the wall and so random that it doesn't feel like there's any personal relevance to it. And that can be a little bit like, for some people, it'd be like, oh, but I wanted something very personally relevant. Now, that being said, even though the experiences in salvia can be personally irrelevant, there's still a lot of healing and shifts taking place on a deeper level. So it's much more of like an energetic medicine. Chemically as well, it's just non-addicting. It's just one doesn't get addicted to it. I mean, let's say I'm having a meditation with salvia, and I'll think, damn, this is nice. Like I'm just like in my meditation. It feels so good. And I even say to myself, like, I need to do this more often. But then the salvia experience fades away, kind of like a dream fades away. And there's just no draw to go back and do it again. There's no hankering. I compare that to like cannabis. I'll have some cannabis, and then a little bit later, I'm like, I kind of want a little bit more cannabis. Or with ketamine, I'll have some ketamine, and I'm like, oh yeah, I definitely want to experience that again. Even if I have like an unpleasant sometimes ketamine experience, there's still that physiological addictive draw to ketamine. But that's just not there with salvia. And so, it's just, I think because it requires multiple visits, it requires intentionality, it requires mindfulness. It can seem personally non-relevant. And at first, it can seem like a little bit uncomfortable in the body. It can feel like you're getting pulled and stretched like taffy, or you can feel yourself kind of being flattened in like a two-dimensional plane. or you might get like prickly sensations on the body. But as one, continues to work with salvia, one can really learn how those can be very useful cues to be used as points of awareness within the body. Um, yeah, there's again just a certain type of maturity, a certain type of presence of mind. You can't really just take it and then zone out. You have to be with it. Whereas, you can take many other substances and just sort of let it do its thing. So I think those are some of the reasons.
No, thank you for laying it out like that. So at this point, you have a pretty firm. Well, I want to ask this before I get to that question. What is the extent of our healing? Where does our healing stop? You're journeying and using different sorts of you're ingesting different kinds of substances, you're having experiences, and I guess your desire to do that just kind of creates the picture of your life, which is exploration, consideration, revelations, whatever your whatever your desire is, however you desire to participate in your given life. When it comes to someone coming to you with a therapeutic goal,
Hmm.
I want to see a somatic psychotherapist and I want to work through things like because I often think about addiction and I think about the culture that we live in and I think about the things that are we consume, the things we process, the interactions we have. And I think I think you could make an argument that really life is all one giant episode of addiction that we never want to end, and we absolutely are horrified when our loved ones go away, and most of us. And so, what is life if not one giant experience of addiction? And what are we really hoping to heal? To what extent? Because so far, no one has evaded death through healing. So, in your opinion, what's it about? How do we strike that balance between being in a perpetual state of addiction and actually achieving a level of healing or transformation that we can be satisfied with?
Hmm. Well, I think of two things. I think we feel satisfied and we feel content with things when we don't feel ourselves being um, unconsciously, unhealthily drawn to something else. Like there's not this feeling of desire for something else. Um, like if there's an addiction, it's kind of always in the back of one's mind. Even if one's doing something else, you're like, oh, when I get off of work, I'm gonna go home and smoke. Or there's this sense of something pulling our attention and awareness away from the present moment. And I feel like when we can have our attention and presence and awareness on the present moment without feeling as if there's other things, whether it's interpersonal conflict pulling our awareness away, or whether it's an addiction to a substance, or whether it's rumination about the past, there are all these things that are kind of pulling us away from ourselves and away from the present moment. And I feel like, one might feel healed and content when there's no longer these things pulling us in some desirous way to something else that's not real. Um, and I remember years ago I had this one Salvia experience where Salvia said to me that there's essentially just one rule, and she said that every day you're lucky enough to get to play in this world. But the only rule is that you have to play nice with others. And so there is this message that comes with Salvia about the playfulness and the importance of play in life. And many people feel that sense of embodied playful happiness with Salvia as well. Um, Archetypal themes that come up are, you know, carnivals and playgrounds and schoolyards, and one actually feels like a sense of play happening within the body. Um, so, I think if there's maybe you can say healing is being in a place of presence and playfulness.
I like that.
Mm.
I find that personally relatable. I'm always grateful for the opportunity to be playful and to be grateful. So I appreciate, and I want to be respectful of your time, and you've opened, you know, you've been instrumental for me in looking into this world, and I'm grateful for what you're doing online. Just your Instagram account was the thing that I saw
Mm,
first, and that's at Salvia Healings, correct?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and
But
then
I recently noticed Instagram changed their silly algorithm. So when you search salvia, even the word salvia itself, it doesn't come up. So it would be better, like if you have Instagram, try search for salvia healings, but it's better if you maybe look for it on the web and then click a link to get to mine. Instagram has recently done this shadow banning of many plant medicine related things. So my account's still there, but you can't search for it. Um, but if you email me at christopher@salviahealings.com or go to my website, salviahealings.com, or type Salvia Healings, I think in Instagram or Google, you can click the link and get there. It's kind of silly that I have to give this workaround right
sure.
now.
Yeah,
But
well, we
yeah.
could get into more discussions as to why that is, but I want to conclude with one question asked in the interest of play and curiosity. And I'm curious to know, and you may have come to these conclusions and revelations through other plant medicine work or other work you've done, but you mentioned early on about the spirit of salvia presenting to you. Maybe it was an earliest salvia experience. I think you said maybe 2012. Maybe that was the lymph, but you recognize that there actually is another entity or entities associated with um, uh, or brought to us through this. I called it a door earlier, but it's some kind of mechanism in the form of a plant, and it is on Earth, maybe because some intelligence has the desire for us to occasionally connect with other
Mm,
entities as part of this rich tapestry of the cosmos, and wherein there are probably innumerable other sorts of beings that could present to one another for whatever reasons at whatever juncture in time
mm.
the universe sees fit. But does it make you a happier person? Does it affect your day-to-day life to know that there are other spirits in time in the universe that we can interact with? Has that been a generally heartening thing for you? And is that even a decent way of putting it?
Yeah, I think it's, um, if anything, it can make one not feel so alone. Sometimes if one's feeling existential angst or loneliness, it's nice to know that there are these other beings out there that are seemingly doing their own thing. It's interesting that when people go to Salvia Land, many times they feel as if they've arrived in the middle of something that's already been happening. It's not as if they arrived in Salvia Land and then something began. They arrived and they're almost like late to something. It's just like, well, we're halfway through the carnival right now, and come and join us. And so, yeah, I think if anything, I think it can provide a sense of reassurance as well that there are these things that one can connect to when maybe sometimes it's more difficult to connect to the human world, or when we feel misunderstood. I think one of the things is many people, when they have these um, entity interactions, there is this sense of empathetic witnessing that comes with it.
Hmm.
And there's this sense of being seen and being understood. And that's very reassuring.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing. Well, I hope that people feel from listening or viewing this interview today that this is something that if they're curious about learning more about, they can connect with you, do research on their own. There are people like yourself who are out there helping to facilitate experiences with what is federally a legal plant, a legal substance,
Mhm.
and then it's further regulated by the states. You said, are there some states where you know that the possession or sale of salvia is not legal?
Yeah, there's it's listed on my website. It's like oh, many of the conservative states, um, Alabama and Arkansas and things like that. No one's ever been convicted of anything salvia related. Um, the plant itself doesn't smell like anything, it doesn't smell like cannabis does.
Yeah.
It just looks like green tea leaves, honestly.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's on a state-by-state basis. Where I am at in California, it's completely legal. You have to be above 18. There are some states like North Carolina where you can own the plant itself for ornamental purposes, but you can't own the extract.
Mm.
And the list is on Wikipedia.
Mm. Not a recreational experience necessarily, but there are analgesic properties and certainly the potential for healing, especially when utilized in the company of a somatic psychotherapist like yourself or somebody else who knows how to have a container and help someone set an intention and navigate a space, a sacred, ceremonial, potentially trans-dimensional space
Mhm.
um, from which we can learn and grow and hopefully heal. I love visiting with you today. I appreciate your time and I appreciate the work that you're doing to bring this information to people. Thank you for being with me on Mind, Ben Christopher.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been great.